really wanted to talk to you about today was particularly the role of innovation and investment, which is often not really talked about in a just transition. We tend to take it as a sort of ethical good or a moral principle in and of itself, and not really talk about the practical, how can we make this investable? How can we get markets and businesses and investors behind it? Because without that, it's really hard to sustain any practice. So it's really fantastic to have a coffee conversation with you about this. But maybe if we take it back to the start, why is a just transition important to you, and where does your passion for justice in this context come from?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes, lately, I have found that question to be quite loaded. Before, if you'd asked it, it'd be very simple, and in the simplest terms put as, just transition matters because, as you said, it's not just about a greener future or about just reducing emissions, but it's really about how do we make sure that no one is left behind. We know the impacts that climate change has, not just economically, but in terms of the types of people in society that it usually affects. And it tends to be those who are deemed as the bottom of the pyramid, the most underserved and underrepresented. So this is people who are either in low-income communities. We do a lot of work in emerging markets. Some of these communities, or let's say archetypes, would be smallholder farmers, urban transporters, micro entrepreneurs, pretty much those who are typically on the front line. But I think personally for me, I care because I didn't grow up in privilege. I've seen how communities can be left out of innovation. And I also see the opportunity when you do include them. So for me, justice in this context is really about ensuring that everyone benefits from the green economy, not just a few. I'm not going to sit here and pray or believe that life is fair and it's going to be an equal society for everyone. I'm yet to see that happen. I know that's not what it's like, and it probably will never be like that. But I believe that the opportunity should be afforded to everybody at the very least. And when you build in silos, particularly in the world of business, because ultimately business solutions are the ones that change the world once they're scaled up. When you build in silos and you don't take up the voices of those that I've just explained, tend to feel the brunt of these transitions that take place every now and then. You also miss out on a huge opportunity for diverse thinking. And you leave out people, you worsen people's lives, but economically you miss out on a lot of, in the investment world, what we call alpha, which is upside, because there's a whole segment or subgroup of people that you don't know nothing about. That's a whole community, region, sometimes country of folks that you are missing out on economic opportunities. If you look at Africa right now, you're seeing this race to Africa from the West and the East in terms of who can get their fingers in, etc., because they can see now that it's a frontier market. Fastest growing population in terms of continent in the world. It's a young Africa. 70% of Africa is under the age of 30. So when you think about economic opportunity, it's bolstered with youth. It's only looking positive, right? But for years, the African narrative has been misunderstood or somewhat omitted from the way we shape society, build for society, and so on and so forth. They've had to basically take on whatever's given to them as opposed to actually it fitting their context. So for me, it's really around, when you're talking about what's the role of investors and entrepreneurship, it's about how do we enable entrepreneurs that are close to the front line, close to the problems, because to me, they have the best solutions. But typically are the ones that are, again, they lack access to mentors, they lack access to resources, they lack access to even expertise, right? How do we make sure that we're supporting them, empowering them? And then those of us that are actually providing the capital, how do we position it in a way that, is right for them as well? How do we make sure that the types of instruments we're giving them is relevant to their context? How do we make sure that they know how to access it? And how do we meet them where they are? So I think for me, there's that, like I said, I've taken you kind of on a roundabout there because that question becomes loaded every year for me. it gets deeper every year for me in terms of what it actually means to make sure that we transition in a just way. So I'll stop there because then I can just be on my soapbox forever.
No, that was brilliant, Mandy, and thank you so much for sharing that. It's really fascinating to think about the international dimensions of this, and think also that it's, I wouldn't necessarily say parallels to the UK context, but of course we know that the UK, which is where the Just Centre is principally operating, has one of the highest regional inequalities in the world. You know, we've got a huge productivity gap between the southeast and northern regions, and between virtually everywhere outside of London and the southeast. And you know, the research by the Institute of Fiscal Studies has highlighted that part of that is a financial problem. It's an inequality of investment and an inequality of financial appetite to invest and to innovate in those places, because after the financial crisis, you know, it's seen as higher risk effectively.
Yes.
What mechanisms have you kind of seen to support people to back these parts of the country, as you say, these, you know, the bottom of the pyramid communities, that quite often it becomes a vicious cycle, doesn't it? You know, no one is prepared to invest in them, so they continually lose out, and then trust in supporting their innovations goes down even further.
One thing that I would say that I love about the UK is we are frontiers when it comes to being innovative in many ways. Finance is one, entrepreneurship is another. I say that because even the context of social investment is still very nascent in a lot of other parts of the world, but we are frontiers in that. And you see that through the different investment funds and foundations that are set up, some specifically to support the regions that are outside of London because they're typically underinvested in, overlooked. You have organizations which are more larger funders, like Better Society Capital. I'd say Big Society Capital, they've changed their name. Better Society Capital, you know, and their whole mission is to take this place-based approach to invest in communities, to again empower them, give them back opportunities, and to support growth, economic growth. You also see quite a few local authorities now looking at how they can look deeper into their local residents and provide innovative funding models that can help them to either start a business at a concessionary rate. I've seen quite a few councils, randomly enough, in London recently that are actually having these abandoned high street spaces and turning them into this new kind of launch it program where people can start businesses at a ridiculously reduced rate, but have a shop front and give them 2 years on this low rate or no rate to build their track record until they can be in a position where they can actually then leapfrog and be on the high street, be able to pay the business rates and so on and so forth. So I see different mechanisms. Sometimes you see grants that are repayable and what have you. You have organizations like Joseph Rowntree, Church of England, who are supporting organizations, grassroots organizations and scalable organizations that are tackling this problem around poverty and inequality. And so for me, I definitely believe that there is opportunities in different pockets of outside of London, but it's still quite nascent. There's still a need for more of this, because I would say the content of impact investing is still quite, or the concept of impact investing is still quite nascent across the UK as a whole, as opposed to, you know, I think the natural assumption is if you're in a developed country, then there's not much aid or supports required or what have you. But there's, like you say, inequality in the UK in different ways. I used to live in Exeter, and I was quite surprised when I lived in the Southwest to see deprivation in a different way. And that was a really eye-opening for myself around what other types of issues exist in the UK that require investment to uplift the communities and change the narrative. So I do believe that there is work being done, but there's still room for more.
Yes, so we saw the creation last year of the Office for Impact Economy, which was really welcome after the advisory board, and is full of, you know, the big hitters in social impact investing and sustainability. Increasingly, people like Legal & General, who've really kind of led the most cutting edge examples of public-private capital and patient capital in this space. And then alongside that, you've got a kind of increasing picture of investment vehicles that are supporting a just transition in different places. Not all of them call it just, but the transition to net zero. So you've got the National Wealth Fund, which was the UK Infrastructure Bank, and the work that they're doing to support local places and to provide safe, de-risked capital there. Then, of course, you've got Innovate UK's new strategy and the wider move by the UK research councils to go to a kind of bucket approach. But particularly under Innovate UK, there's more of a shift, as far as we've seen it so far, towards supporting, the brightest and biggest minds in innovation. And then in the middle of that, you've also got the local power plans, which is a more kind of community energy-led focus, building capacity for mixed energy portfolios, but building in very, very deliberately a just transition principle, which is incredibly welcome. So you've got a lot of investment vehicle going into place, and that's before you get to the more kind of private sector investments and the trust and foundation and charitable sphere. And I suppose the risks with that type of combination of funding is, if you look at which places are benefiting and which are increasingly the kind of models of investment that they're providing, there is a risk that the investment market moves closer to, I suppose the phrase has been told, low-hanging fruit, or the more likelihood of return, this focused on the brightest and best in innovation or the ready to transition places. And that's because of the return on investment, I guess. And it really makes you question kind of how places that perhaps have some of the biggest disadvantages or the hardest, thorniest issues for a just transition, how are they going to get investment? What is the investment model that is going to support them? So I'd be really interested, what gives you hope in terms of the investment landscape for a just transition, and where are there still gaps in our UK investment picture?
So there's a great analogy out of Cambridge University's Institute for Sustainability Leadership, or Sustainability Leadership, that talks about rewiring the economy. And they have this analogy where they talk about policy and regulations set the playing field. Business is the engine and capital is the fuel, finance is the fuel. And for me, that's spot on. That's absolutely spot on. So if we're looking at the business and the funding or the capital side, well, without no fuel, there's no destination. And so if there's no capital feeding and scaling these impactful solutions, then it's not a game worth playing. There's no point of anyone even waking up every day and trying to build this solution if there's no one that's going to support them to scale up the impact and scale the work that they're doing. So for me, it's pivotal, and that's why it's really important as well. I mean, I love the whole evolution of sustainable finance and the different innovative, blended finance mechanisms and vehicles that are being developed so that, like you say, it can be appropriate to the beneficiaries that it's trying to reach and the communities they're trying to reach, because it's not a one size fits all. And so it's great to see more people having impact frameworks, to see the office come up, etc. But for me, I think we definitely need to see more capital flow into this space. I don't have the data off head right now in terms of what the gap is, but every year we have a massive finance gap in terms of funding climate change and wider just transition issues. So it would be really great if we could see more capital flow into this space, and just more innovation in the way that it's delivered as well, and the way that people can access it. It doesn't have to be a straight loan. It doesn't have to be a straight equity ticket. It could be done in different ways. It can be multi-year, it can be concessionary. There are lots of different ways that you can even attract private capital if there was more catalytic capital layers in the way in which we approach how we reach these beneficiaries through our funding. And I've had the pleasure of seeing that happen in other parts of the world, and I'm hoping that we get to see more of that happening in the UK at some point.
So I suppose my question to you is, what kind of innovation pipeline of people and skills as well as capital do you think we need?
Yeah, I mean, you have to decide what role you want to play in the argument. It's like even in the conversation with climate change, um, you have the philanthropists, you know, who are happy to give non-dilutive, you know, only maybe impact linked capital. So you can try and you can go out there and try and make an impact. Then you have obviously private sector that are looking for some sort of return, or, you know, they're looking for you to achieve something in addition to their capital. Even in the wider context of climate change, you have activists, and you know, you have people who are doing in terms of driving change in their own way. And I just think you need to decide what role you know, we want to play at the center. Because for me, there are young people who have great solutions all over the UK, but connecting them to capital that will allow them to just have space. So there's different types of people who become founders or innovators as well. There are people who it's in their DNA, maybe from family links or just friends and association. It's normal for them to start a business, and actually they would know who they could go to access some capital from, and it wouldn't be a challenge for them. There are also, if I go a bit deeper, again, different archetypes, women who want to start businesses that, but perhaps maybe due to different lifestyle situations, maybe family burden or what have you, they may not have the access to capital to just start, etc. The people from working class backgrounds that again don't have certain privileges is the probably the better way or appropriate way to say it. And so for me, I don't think there's a problem with a pipeline of people trying to find solutions. It's how, again, what role do you want to play in the value chain, and how catalytic do you want to be? If you want to start and back those who want to start, then I would just invest at that layer and make sure that you are supporting them with, like you were saying, the impact, or, you know, how do they get to the just, how do they become more just, or how do they get to the just impact frameworks that are required. But you just need to decide which role you want to play in the value chain. From my perspective, we've always played in the space where maybe you've had that kickstart from university via a grant, but after that you're going into the big bad world, and who's going to support you? So that cushion layer is no longer there, and then that's where we come and take over and help you through capacity building, through venture programs, in terms of how to basically professionalize the concept and turn it into somewhat of a startup business. And then now we have these funds that we're raising. How do we then move on and support you to, you know, attract capital? And maybe before you do that, we will be your first backer to back you, so that you can have an opportunity to go to said investor and say, I am credible because this organization has put capital behind me. But before they get to us, somebody has to support them, somebody has to seed them. And if you look at climate solutions, they're still quite new. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, they were first of a kind. You know, there were nothing had of these types of solutions were ever in the market. And so people had to really take a bet and believe in these types of companies. And it was mainly the universities that were doing it. It was mainly philanthropic capital that was doing it. Innovate UK played a huge role in the emergence of early climate technology solutions in the United Kingdom. So I would say, you know, it's really around understanding which layer you want to play within, and then supporting and doubling down on that.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mandy. I wondered whether or not you have a couple of specific examples that you think are particularly strong innovations, or, you know, entrepreneurs that have worked specifically on a just transition, because I think for a lot of people in the investment world, it's easy to think about, you know, the proposition in the renewables market, and, you know, there's a really strong drive there. There's obviously, it's patchy, you know, storage, you know, is harder to invest in than certain other aspects of renewables. I think people feel a bit more familiar now, as you said, you know, that 10-year timeline with climate tech. How do we get the justice dimensions of these? Because there's the justice dimension of who innovates, and then there's the justice dimension of the innovation itself. And I think the second one is where people really struggle. We often get the question, what's net zero and what's a just transition, and how are they different? And we know that they can be vastly different, actually. But it's quite hard. How would you conceptualize that? And have you seen a really good example that could bring it to life, I guess?
That's a great question. I have, and I'm not sure where the business is at right now, but I have seen a business that I really liked the concept because I understood the community they were trying to reach. So I think you probably know SMEs make up, I believe, 90% or more of the UK economy. They're basically the backbone of our job creation in the United Kingdom. But they're small businesses, and sometimes they're not set up to be able to receive traditional funding from banks or whatever the case may be. But there's this huge agenda for them to go green and go fast by a said date, right? And no one is accounting for the fact that they need to find capital to help them to actually make that transition to solar or whatever the case may be. So we supported a business through one of our programs that essentially was helping SMEs specifically to access finance to help them to basically go green, because the banks couldn't lend to them because of just the state of type of business that they were, etc. And the what's the name of the organization? Those that basically would go and do the fit out would really wanted to serve that community, but they couldn't afford them. And so they had a pipeline of customers that had come and they couldn't afford their products. And then you have the banks who couldn't afford them, lend them the capital. So they sat in a layer somewhat in between, where they were providing more affordable rates for them to be able to access capital to then transition. And I thought that was really great because, there, like you said, there are some people in certain parts that don't, the language that we use is not, it's not friendly, it's not even relatable. Net zero, I mean, what are we even talking about here? So they needed someone who could meet them where they were, that would do that educational piece, as well as then support them properly with capital to help them to do that transition. And this is what this organization did. And I felt that would have been a really great opportunity to see a just transition at scale. But I'm not quite sure where they are at the moment. It tends to be typically sometimes those concepts that are hard to crack. If they don't raise, investment can be quite a tricky and technical process. If you don't raise within certain windows, then sometimes the company doesn't stay alive, and so on and so forth. But the mission could be so strong. And so that was one that I saw that I really like. There are more, but not off the top of my head right now that I can jump out and say, offhead.
No, that's a beautiful one. And one of our partners at the Just Centre is the British Chambers of Commerce, which represents the SME businesses. And a consistent challenge they were bringing to us was, often there is not even one person responsible for this. There's no one responsible for the transition of that small business. Some of these are sole traders, but they, a lot of them are for, a more sustainable model. They can see the benefits, they can see the direction the market is going, and they want to have social impact. And a lot of them are local. We talk of pride in place at a national scale. Business, I think a few people, including our other partners, business in the community, like to talk of pride of place. They see deep, community benefit coming from moving to a more decarbonised future. And they can see it, literally in the local communities that they serve, and any kind of innovation that would support the SME sector to transition, fairly and ethically, I think would be a fantastic just transition investment as well. I don't want to take too much of your time, Mandy, but we thought we'd try and. We always like to think about where do the surprising things, and I think in and of itself, a conversation about investing in a just transition is surprising to a lot of people, because I think a lot of people think that, it just can't be done. What do you feel are the sort of particular frictions or blockers to gathering more investment in the just transition space?
It's interesting. I've seen it in different forms. So on the funder side, sometimes just the way that funders are set up, they are set up to operate in silos. So I remember speaking to a large financial institution once, talking about the just transition, and they couldn't get their head round how issues pertaining climate change, intersecting with race or intersecting with gender, could come together and be one program. They had a department for gender, a department for climate change, and a department for race, and they couldn't get together and fund us because they worked in silos. So sometimes there are barriers that you don't even understand is happening on the corporate side, that also stifle and become bottlenecks to, you know, how much we can make a change within the whole just transition concept. I think just transition means different things in different regions. So the question you asked me previously, if you asked me to give an example in Africa, I could give you loads, because their impact is, you could do something really deemed to be small in the UK, but you've made a massive impact in their community there. And impact is the forefront of conversations as opposed to an afterthought, which is unfortunately what it kind of looks like in most parts of the West. And so I think there's, on the funder side, there's that. But I also think that on the innovator side, it also depends on, I'd say, like the founder archetype, like I was mentioning earlier on before. Again, if you don't have access to certain networks, if you don't have family and friends you can go and get £100,000 from to start, then again, that stifles the opportunity for more funding to crowd together to go into a just transition solution. And, you know, some of these blockers are the reason why some ideas around the just transition don't leave someone's desktop or dinner table, etc. And because where do they even start?
I mean, it is a really, really challenging landscape at the moment because we have a world that's effectively in polycrisis, a UK that is in a polycrisis that is a mixture of really long-term entrenched wicked problems and new issues that have surfaced and then been exacerbated, some by policies of the last 20 years and some just by the global landscape and our, you know, political economy and position around that. And I think what we're really trying to make the case for here is the benefits of a just transition, the impact that a just transition can have. And, you know, that involves as well thinking about the impact of investment and thinking about how can you maximize co-benefit impact, so benefits across social, economic, place-based, health and environmental transition as one package, basically. And you know, we have a scopes framework and we have some tools that we're developing under the Just Centre that help different parts of the ecosystem, including investment, to co-design their impact so that it starts from community and place and it flows outwards through all sectors of the economy, you know, the employment system, the skills-based system, and, you know, what we would more traditionally conceive of as social value metrics. But all that is really hard. And I just wanted to sort of start ending on a positive note in the face of all that difficulty by asking, what gives you hope at the moment in this space?
It's a very grim world right now, so I'm literally digging for some hope. I think what keeps me going, which I guess is some form of hope, is the fact that we've seen historically wherever there needs to be a massive kind of systemic change and there's a lot of focus on it, when you apply the pressure, even the climate conversation, all the way back in the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, we've come a long way. When you apply the pressure and you continue discussing it and keeping it alive, change will come. It becomes disheartening because when you know something can be done today, but it's done in 20 years' time, that can be quite frustrating. But I do believe that change will come because the world is becoming more and more intersectional in so many different ways. And so it will become very difficult to ignore the fact that you can't treat these issues in silos anymore. They are all interlinked. And if you start treating them in isolation, you're never going to solve the problem. You're never going to have great opportunities, you know? So I do believe that over time, that financial impact will be felt because of that ignorance. And that will probably, unfortunately, be the driver for a lot of people to make that change, a lot of organizations to make that change. But it will happen. It will happen. And so I think that gives me hope. And I think I've got to a point now where when you think with like a legacy mindset, you don't get obsessed around whether or not you are there to see it in its full fruition, but the fact that you managed to play a role in the seeding of it, I think, is powerful.
Thank you, Mandy. And I think that's an incredibly powerful way to finish, because I think part of the problem that we've got to, in terms of certainly government in some ways, but also in some sectors that have been perhaps operating, with the best intention, but in silos, is that we're trying to take on the entire problem head on and saying, if we can't solve every aspect of a just transition in a whole place at the same time, then is there any point in acting? And of course, what you're saying is there is a point, there is a critical point in seeding parts of a just transition. And then naturally, as we're seeing with, the pace, for example, that renewable innovation has taken, naturally letting the market and the social dynamics do some of the rest of the work. And at the Just Centre, we are first and foremost about joining up. Just is actually an acronym for Joined Up Sustainability Transformations. And what we really believe in is that even if you're seeding and then scaling small parts of the transition, when you join them up, you bring it a little bit closer to having the powerful, accelerated impact that we all want and we really need to see in these urgent climate emergency times. So thank you so much for talking to me today, and also for being our chair in this endeavour. Thank you.